Hello everybody, welcome back. This is History with Hilbert bringing you another video on my channel. Now today, because of a request from one of my friends, shout out to Ilse Oxnard here, I am making a video about the American Civil War, and this is going to be a very quick video. Well, at least I'm hoping it's going to be a very quick video, because as you can see, the American Civil War lasted for 4 years, and it involved millions of people, so it's going to be impossible to make a video to do it justice that doesn't last a few hundred hours. So this is just going to be a quick overview of the American Civil War for those of you who don't know maybe what it was about, you don't know much about it, and would like to find out some more. So throughout this video I'm going to be making sweeping and unforgivable generalizations, and you might be thinking, what? History with Hilbert saying things that aren't true? And yes, it's true, I might say things which won't be 100% accurate for all the cases that you apply them to, because as I said, it's a war that lasted for 4 years with millions of people involved and people who were affected by it. So not everything I say is going to be accurate for all of those. It's going to be very hard to make judgments or to make statements that are completely accurate for all of these, and for that I will apologise. And I'm sure in the comment section, the more astute of you will, say, that thing you said, that was actually wrong, because this, and that's fine. Please do that. I love you guys. You guys are great. I learned so much from people in the comment section. Can't praise you enough. But in this video, just, cut me a bit of slack, because it's a video that I'm going to try and go over the whole American Civil War in one video, so it's going to be quite difficult to do. But just bear that in mind. I will still obviously be trying to make it as accurate as I can throughout, because, that's what I do. But just, keep that in mind. Now, one example of this is actually that the two flags I used on the first page were both inaccurate. That was the modern American flag with all 50 stars, and of course the stars represent the amount of states in the Union. And back in 1861, there would have just been 34 states and 34 stars. And the other flag actually never represented the Confederate States of America, but was rather its battle flag. So they were both wrong. So there you go, I've already done things wrong. Anyway, moving on. Now, to understand the American Civil War, one of the key things that you will come across is the secession. Now, secession is when part of a country will leave another part of the country and become independent, or try to. And in the case of the American Civil War, it's the case of the southern states in the United States of America breaking away from the northern states and forming their own country called the Confederate States of America. Now, the secession is the ultimate cause of the Civil War, and the secession is pretty much largely based on slavery and the issue of whether slavery should be made illegal or should remain legal on a state-by-state basis. Now, there were obviously other reasons for the American Civil War, but the secession based on slavery is pretty much the central one. Now, states could actually decide whether or not they would allow slavery to be legal or illegal in their states. When the US gained independence from the British in 1783, slavery was legal in 9 of the 13 colonies. So already, before the United States of America had actually won their War of Independence, there were already states who had abolished slavery. But there were also, the majority of the colonies, of the 13 colonies, which are represented by the 13 red stripes on the American flag, in case you didn't know, they had actually legalized slavery, or they hadn't abolished slavery, rather. And many of the founding fathers, for example, George Washington, owned slaves. States could actually choose to make slavery illegal, so people who thought that the institution of slavery should be made illegal because they thought it was morally wrong, or they wanted to get at someone who had slaves, they were called abolitionists. And if you think of the English word abolition, it means to stop it. If you think of abort, it's to stop something. So abolitionists are people who believe that slavery should be made illegal throughout the United States. And in America, we see that the northern states of America had far more abolitionists than the South, which is why in the North, slavery became illegal. Now, slave states were generally to the south, and in fact that isn't really a generalization. As you can see on the map, the ones in red and yellow were the slave states, and they were all to the south of the free states, which became the Union states, which had made slavery illegal. Now, the dividing line between the two was called the Mason-Dixie line, and this is why you will hear some people calling the American South Dixie or Dixieland. Strictly speaking, again, this isn't true, because the Mason-Dixie line was actually created to settle a dispute between several states. But pretty much all the time you can say that if it's to the south of the Mason-Dixie line, the state had legalized slavery, and if it was to the north of the Mason-Dixie line, then slavery would be illegal. The government had to ensure that there was equilibrium between slave and free states, which became complicated when territory in the West was also divided into states. So, for example, you have obviously people moving west. That's the Great Westward Trek. That's when they came into conflict with the Indians in the center of the continent. And soon places in the West were becoming just as settled as in the East. And the American system was that you would divide land to the west into territory. So you had, for example, the Washington Territory in the very northwest of the United States. But soon, in 1850, California was made a state, and it was made a free state, which meant that slavery was illegal in California. And this actually tipped the balance of slave to free states in favor of the abolitionists. And this sent alarm bells going off for southern slave owners who thought, well, if there's one more free state than slave state, then that could signify, a change in policy towards slavery, that they soon might try to make it illegal for all the states. Now, something very important to consider as well is that the North became more industrialized. There were more immigrants from Europe coming in, and they didn't need slaves. Now, the industrialization process and the large immigration sort of went hand in hand. You had more immigrants coming over, which meant you had more people, which also meant there would then be more money coming in, and these immigrants would often work in factories and things like that. So more and more factories sprang up in the northern cities, and things became industrialized. It was less about small-scale farming, as it used to be in the north and remained to be in the south, and it became more about the free labour. It became more about everyone's right to work equally. So then you have this situation that there is an American-born man, he's paid the normal wage in a factory, and you have an Irishman who has just come over a few weeks before, has got the job, but he was born and raised in Ireland. But this black guy, who was also born here, his father was born here and his before him, isn't being paid because he's a slave. And in the North, abolitionism quickly takes root and slavery disappears. Because of this influx of people, you start to see that people start to value free labour more and the rights of the labouring man, which is why it disappeared. However, the situation's different in the South. The South didn't have large cities such as there were in the North, for example, New York or Boston or Philadelphia. And they especially had fewer cities on the coast. Because in the north, New York attracted lots and lots of immigrants. So you had lots of Irishmen coming over, you have Scotsmen, Germans, the Polish, Italians, all coming into New York because it was on the coast. They could get boats there from Europe, and that was that. You had a lot of immigrants coming in. In the south, you didn't have as many large cities, and you had even fewer on the coast, which meant it attracted less immigrants. And partially because of it attracting less immigrants, and partially because it was an agricultural society, you don't get this large-scale industrialization that happens in the north. And the southern economy does, in fact, need slavery to continue to work the way it does, because the slaves were the ones who picked the cotton, who worked, to get the sugar. And all of these industries were incredibly lucrative. People became incredibly rich from these industries. And without the slaves, these industries couldn't keep going. And because it didn't industrialize like the North, you don't get, the free labor movement. You don't get this whole idea that everyone should be equal because, you've got lots of lower class working people from Europe coming in. It's just not the same in the South, which is why you get these two different attitudes. And in 1860, you get Abraham Lincoln becoming the President of the United States. And he is an abolitionist president, which means that he doesn't believe the institution of slavery should continue to be legal, no matter where it is. And he doesn't, in fact, initially go after his abolitionist views when he's in government, but the southern states don't care. They see this as, the turning point. And quite rightly, Abraham Lincoln, had the southern states not decided to secede, would have, implemented the policy of the emancipation of people of colour who were enslaved at the time. And because of his presidency, the southern states from 1860 start to secede from the Union. Now, we're going to have a look at a few other factors that actually led to the war, rather than just the secession, which was the previous page. So, as we mentioned before, you have this shift from agrarian to industrial culture in the north with the free labour movement, the idea that people should be born equal, should be paid equal for doing the same amount of work. Whereas in the south, this doesn't really happen. Furthermore, you also have the rise of the American middle class and moralism. Now, because you have so many lower class working people coming in from Europe who are willing to, work for less because they have to, because otherwise their kids will starve, this also creates a super wealthy upper class, a much smaller number, but it does create them. The factory owners, they can exploit the working man. I know I'm starting to sound like Karl Marx, and I apologise, but this was technically the case in America in the 1850s and 60s. So you have these very rich factory owners who can accept who they want and generally pay what they want, because people were desperate and they had to agree to this wage. There was no minimum wage back then. And this created a landed upper class, which was very rich. But you also had the guys in America, who might have been farmers at the time of the American Revolution, who aren't doing too badly for themselves, They don't have to sweat through every day to bring home just enough money to buy enough bread that their children won't starve. That's not really happening to them. They're not super wealthy, they're not one of the aristocracy, but they're not bad. And generally speaking, when you have the growth of a middle class, you start to see moralism appear. And it's the same today. A lot of feminists and social justice warriors and people who claim to be working for the lower class or the oppressed in society are from the middle class, because the middle class, they're not super wealthy, and who generally speaking, again, this isn't true in all cases, but who generally speaking are quite happy that they are the upper class and they won't, muck in and get involved with the lower classes. That's just the way of the world. But these middle classes will, and the middle classes often develop a sense of morals, of what's right and wrong, which in the case of the Northern American states often went with, I think, Quakerism, baptism, those kind of things. And they then obviously get on board the abolitionist train, because that's hype. That was hype at the time. And they see, well, in these southern states, these black people who, are born equal to us, why are they being treated so differently? Can a house divided still stand? I know I've just butchered that quote, but the sentiment remains the same. Now, you also have this issue of federal and state rights. Now, basically, the distinction is that federal rights are for the whole country, for the United States of America, the rights that are decided on in Washington, D.C. from the government. But you also have state rights, which are from the individual states. For example, in Florida, you will find different laws than in Delaware, because the different state laws are in motion. Although federal laws technically should be the same in Florida and Delaware, because those are the laws that the United States government think every state should have, and that they shouldn't really have a say other than in Congress. Now, relating this back to the American Civil War, the federal rights would indicate that they would have a push, an anti-slavery push, an abolitionist push, which obviously the states that became rich from slavery would not want. And that is why the southern states, who profited most from slavery, and who, let's be fair, their economy needed slavery lest it would collapse, they voted to secede from the Union so that they wouldn't be influenced by federal rights anymore. We also have to look at the explosion of the cotton trade. Between 1790 and 1860, cotton production went through the roof. It went from 3,000 bales to 4.5 million bales. And this is obviously an extremely lucrative business, and people became very rich, and people wanted to hold on to this wealth. You often see pictures of the southern plantation houses with these very big, nicely decorated houses with these massive pillars, almost making you think of Roman, but then the rest built in wood. Well, this was because there were a select few in the South who became extremely rich from slavery. Something else that often isn't considered is actually that secession wasn't illegal. The southern states could, by law, leave the North. after the American Civil War, it was written into the Constitution that secession should be illegal. But at the time, the Southern states were completely entitled to leave the North behind and form their own confederacy. Now, to understand the war, we need to look at how it started, obviously, and those were some of the reasons as to why there were differences between North and South and why they would go to war. But then now we need to look at the direct things that happened, the direct line of events. Now, obviously, in 1860, the Southern states start to secede, and basically what the secession entailed was that the Confederates would occupy the South. They took over federal institutions, for example, forts, railway stations, that kind of thing, anything that was nationalized that the government would own. And they basically took it over and set up their own government. I think they changed the capital several times. I think it was in Mobile, Alabama first. I might be wrong about that, don't quote me. But they changed the capital several times, and they basically formed their own United States, but then the Confederate States. Now, one of these forts refused to surrender, and this is the quite famous Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter was a fort in Virginia where the Union garrison refused to surrender to the Confederacy. Now, neither the Union or the Confederacy wanted to come off as the aggressor in this situation. Obviously, to the Confederates, this is the Federal soldiers, the Union, still in southern land that they now saw as independent, and they obviously wanted them to get off their land. But the North and the Federals saw this as the last bastion of freedom and government control in the South, and neither side wanted to. Basically, neither side wanted to have the other side take or keep Fort Sumter. But when the garrison refused to surrender to the Confederates, the Southern artillery opened fire and thus started the war. Now, to understand the war, we need to look at the two sides. So the Union are also called the Yankees, the Blues, which is down to the colour of the uniform they wore, the North, and the Federals, again relating to their geographical location and the type of government, because they were the federal government rather than the government that rebelled and broke away. Now, one thing we see with the Union is that throughout the first few years, they had several poor leaders in very high commissions. So, for example, you had General Ambrose Burnside. Now, if I'd been in charge, I would never have put this guy at the head of my army. But they did, and this led to some quite costly failures. However, towards the end of the war, the Union does, sort itself out and start to get better leadership. He had a large manpower to draw on, especially from the northern cities with large populations of immigrants. I believe that during the American Civil War, a quarter of the Union Army was born outside of the United States of America, with the largest percentages being those Germans, Irish, Italians, and Polish. Now, as well as this, they were an industrial power, which means that they have a lot of factories, and in these factories they can produce better, they can produce more, and they can produce faster than a non-industrialized power like the South. So, for example, these factories could produce weapons, munitions, artillery, and as well as this being an industrialized power, they also had far more railroads which connected, so they could send troops to the South, to the battlefields, and transport goods and resources as well, which is obviously something you clearly need in a war. As well as this, they had a navy, which meant that they could attack the Southerners from by river and by sea, but as well that they could embargo, which basically means they could stop other nations trading with the Confederate States of America, as well as being able to blockade them, stopping any imports and exports getting through. And finally, they also had an established army. Now, obviously, the Union was just the United States of America, so they had the US Army at their disposal. The South obviously didn't, so the South had to create their own army, and this was a big advantage for the Union. They after a while they did conscript men, but initially they had a standing army, an already trained army, with which they hoped to destroy the South. Now, the Confederacy were also called rebels, bushwhackers, greys, and the South, which basically relates to the colour of their uniform, the fact that they were seen to have rebelled from the United States of America, and that they used guerrilla tactics well against their northern counterparts. Now, the Confederacy it's often seen that Confederacy had better generals than the North, which isn't entirely true. They did have a good select group of generals, especially towards the start of the war, who had attended the West Point military institution, which was where many generals from both sides actually went to learn the art of war. But they did have some very, very good generals, without which they probably wouldn't have lasted very long against the might of the North. For example, they had Robert E. Lee, who was the commander-in-chief of all the troops, as well as famous figures such as Thomas Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet. And Thomas Stonewall Jackson is in fact my profile picture for the channel if you are interested, although that's not actually him, that's a depiction of him from the film Gods and Generals, which I highly recommend you check out if you like this video and are interested in the American Civil War. I might make a video about that film at some point, because I think it would be worthwhile for you guys to have a look and maybe to explore the historical accuracy of it. Anyway, the Confederacy also had many men that were experienced with weaponry. Now, the Confederacy, unlike the Union, had to conscript a lot of men straight away. Now, there were a few units stationed in the South that defected from the United States. They were, say, American United States troops, but when the southern states seceded, they changed allegiance to their state, which sort of makes sense if you think about it. But they also had to conscript large amount of men. Now, the Union did set in a draft as well, which meant that they forced men to join up, or at least some men to join up, which caused massive riots. But the Confederacy, at least at first, they also had a draft, and I think that came a year earlier than the Union draft. But many men volunteered for the Confederacy, and the Confederacy was lucky in that many of the men who joined up were already experienced with guns. So many were hunters, trappers, people who knew what they were doing with these weapons, which really helped them. As well as this, they were very good at guerrilla tactics, which many of them had learnt from the Native Americans when they'd fought against them in the various wars in the South. However, the Confederacy did have a smaller manpower to draw on. Now, obviously, numbers don't mean anything in a fight. Don't mean everything, rather than anything, sorry. They don't mean everything in a fight. But if you run out of men, well, you can't keep fighting, you lose the war. The North obviously had a much larger manpower to draw on, and in all the major conflicts of the American Civil War, the South was pretty much significantly outnumbered in all of them. They were also an agricultural power, although technically speaking the North and the South were pretty much 50-50. They were pretty much balanced as to how much food they could produce. So they were much more rural-based economy. But that was also an advantage. Their roads weren't as good, but that meant that the Union Army trying to invade would have a harder time getting round as well. So it worked both ways for the Confederacy. Now we're going to have a look at some of the key moments of the American Civil War. Now, the first one that I've chosen is the First Battle of Bull Run. It's called the First Battle of Manassas, or the First Manassas by the South, and Bull Run by the North. I'm actually going to be making a video in the future as to why the two sides named battles differently in the American Civil War, because I think it's quite interesting, so stay tuned for that one. With the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, however you wish to call it, many Northerners thought that the Federal Army, the trained United States Army, would decimate the rebel army, and actually came to picnic to watch the battle just from a nearby hill. So you have all these Northerners, all these, lawyers, people of the gentry, some of this middle class that I spoke of, coming to the battlefield, just sitting on a hill right next to the battlefield to watch, because they thought it would be that much of a pushover. Now imagine someone today thinking, oh, ISIS, the US Marines going to absolutely hammer them, we're just going to fly over to Syria to watch. It seems absolutely stupid, but that's what happened at the First Battle of Bull Run. You had this massive crowd of spectators who came to watch the battle, thinking that it would be an absolute show and the rebels would be completely destroyed. Now, fighting centred around Henry House Hill, and the tide of the battle kept changing, because obviously you had troops all over the country, both in the Confederate States and in the United States, and these troops kept coming in by railway. It's the first time that railways played a pivotal part in a battle, and at the Battle of the First Manassas, all these different troops come in by rail to reinforce either side, and because of this, the tide of the battle changes. You might get a company of Zouaves coming in for the north. They'll have an advance, push the rebels back a bit, but then the rebels might be reinforced from, I don't know, the 33rd Virginia, and the 33rd Virginia would join in and help stop the balance, and this kept going for several hours. Now, Brigadier General Thomas Jackson arrived by train to reinforce the crumbling Confederate position on Henry House Hill, and it said that he stayed so calm as, the musket balls are whizzing around him, the shells are exploding, that General B remarked, "Yonder stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let's go to his assistance." Now, rallying the Southern troops in a charge, the newly christened General Stonewall Jackson pushed the Federals back and caused them to rout back to Washington. The battle was very important because it showed the South that the South would not be a pushover as the picnicking Northerners had thought, and in fact, as the Northern troops retreated, obviously the picnickers panicked because they were obviously at the side of a battle and their side had lost, and they thought, oh God, the Confederates are going to push after. Now, luckily for them, the Confederates were in no state to chase after the army, but the picnickers in their wagons and carriages, they were on the road, blocking the road, and all these retreating troops are on the road as well, and it was absolute mayhem. And had the Confederates been able to organise themselves, they might have pushed on and taken Washington, D.C. right at the start before the Civil War could really get underway. What a world we would live in now if that had happened. But it didn't. The rebel army wasn't organised enough, and their units were all muddled together, and it didn't happen, and the Union managed to sort their shit out the next day. Now, the second one that I've chosen is the Battle of Hampton Roads in 1861, and it's a significant battle in many ways because it's the first battle between two ironclads, which are these ships made out of iron, which came into common use in the 1860s and then thereafter completely replaced wooden ships. Now, it's often called the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimac, or the CSS Virginia, and soon all world powers would be using these iron ships rather than wooden ships, which had dominated up to that point from ever, really. Since after the Polynesians started building their ones out of reed, it's been wooden ships in combat. But the Battle of Hampton Roads changed this. Now, the battle was inconclusive, although the CSS Virginia did manage to sink some of the wooden ships which were helping the northern side. But after the battle, the CSS Virginia sailed back to the harbour and was scuttled the day after because it ran out of fuel. And after this, there were a few naval combats in the American Civil War, but this is arguably the most famous. Now, we have in 1862, as part of a plan to attack the heart of the Confederacy by water, the Union gunboats capture New Orleans. This is partly the brainchild of Winfield Scott, who was also the orchestrator of the plan in 1848 in the Mexican-American War to march the American army right the way down through Mexico and capture Mexico City, which they astoundingly did. Now, his plan for the American Civil War was to obviously engage the Southern troops on land in the centre of the country, but then also to send gunboats down the rivers and down the coast as well, and blockade the South. So basically his idea was called the Anaconda Plan, and like an anaconda, it was meant to squeeze the life out of the Confederate States. Nothing coming in, nothing coming out, army coming down the north, gunboats taking the coastal cities. And it was meant to take a few years, and it did, but essentially the Anaconda Plan worked, and that is why the Confederates were defeated. Now, the Battle of Antietam in 1862 halted Confederate General Lee's advance north through Maryland, quite possibly saving Washington, D.C. from falling into rebel hands. It's famous for being the bloodiest single day in American history, with just shy of 23,000 casualties falling, and that's just on the single day. I believe the picture you are seeing here is of Bloody Lane, which was a lane which was held by Union soldiers against many, many Confederate assaults, and I think lots of the casualties fell in and around the lane. I might be wrong, that might be the Battle of Shiloh. Don't bite my head off, but please do correct me. Next, I've got the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the decree that allowed black people to enlist in the United States Army. It's usually seen as a response to the loss of manpower suffered by the North at Antietam. I'm rather skeptical of Lincoln. I don't think he was doing this because he believed in equality and that black people and white people were the same. I think he needed troops, and who better to enlist into the army than the people they were trying to make free, or supposedly trying to make free, by recapturing the South. So after Antietam, obviously 23,000 casualties, I think over half of which were northern casualties. That's, give or take 11,000 casualties. You need to, get more men into the army to keep fighting. So they allow black people to enlist in the army. Now, in the first few years of the war, black people were formed into segregated regiments and didn't do much of the fighting, instead doing menial tasks that their southern counterparts, who were still slaves, were also doing rather than actually fighting. Now, when in combat, however, many black regiments more than proved their mettle, such as at the Battle of Milliken's Bend, where they single-handedly defeated a numerically superior force of Confederates after their white comrades had fled. At its height, 1 in 8 Northerners in uniform were black, so that's sort of giving an indication of how many black people actually fought in the United States Army. Towards the end of the war, the last few months of the war, that is, the Confederates also allowed black people into the army. But before this time, they actually had black people doing useful tasks for the army. So maybe building bridges over somewhere, or preparing food, or cleaning up bodies, that kind of thing. So they did utilize black people in that way, but didn't allow them to fight until the very end, when even they knew it was all over, really. On December the 13th, the blue and the grey clashed again at Fredericksburg. The Union soldiers under Major General Ambrose Burnside, who I mentioned earlier, were attempting to dislodge the rebels from their entrenched heights around the city. The attack ended in bloody failure, the Federals losing over 3 times as many men as the triumphant Confederates. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg, obviously very, very famous in American history, and it's a name, that's known worldwide. Now, the following summer after Fredericksburg, Lee was on the move again, seeking to drive his forces north, forcing federal politicians to sue for peace, because obviously if Lee could push farther north enough to worry the North that, oh God, what if they capture one of our cities? I think the aim of the campaign, the Gettysburg campaign, in fact, was for Lee to maybe pressure Philadelphia, because if the South, this Southern army that's marched from Virginia can make its way to Philadelphia unchallenged, then the North would start to want to get peace. There were already loud voices in the North calling for peace, because they thought, why are we fighting our own countrymen? Why don't we just let them go and stop all this bloodshed? And Lee's idea was, well, if we push far north enough, then these voices will increase, and the Union will have to sign a peace treaty. Now, a small skirmishing, some say over New Boots, in fact, expanded, and more units funneled into Gettysburg, until both Lee and Union General Meade, who replaced another, it might have been McDowell or McClellan, or another one, again, correct me if I'm wrong, decided to engage in battle. On the 1st of July, the rebels carried all before them, pushing the Northerners back onto a row of hills, which they would repeatedly attack to no avail for the next 2 days, turning previously unknown geographical places like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill into the stuff of legend. The final dramatic climax of the battle was when 12,500 Confederates swept across Cemetery Hill, but were repulsed by the Union defenders, making Pickett's charge a costly Confederate failure. The Battle of Gettysburg is often seen as the turning point of the war, and coupled with the loss of General Stonewall Jackson some months earlier, it was a terrible blow to the Southern hopes of winning the war. And from this point on, we start to see that the South doesn't actually invade the North as much. It plays more of a defensive war, often using guerrilla tactics. Now, because of these guerrilla tactics, the North also change tactics, and often when one side will use guerrilla tactics and will hide behind the population, the other side will target the population to get back at the guerrilla fighters. And we see exactly the same happening in the American Civil War. Now, General Grant was promoted to head of the U.S. Army shortly after Gettysburg, or I believe he was given a very prominent position in the American Army. And he advocated a scorched earth policy against them, which basically meant burning everything before you to force the enemy into submission. It's very brutal, but it's very effective and it works. After defeating the rebels outside the city, Federal General Sherman shelled Atlanta and eventually pushed Southern General Hood from the key location and took the city of Atlanta in what I believe is Georgia. Now, following the 9-month siege of Petersburg, Union troops cut the Southern Army in two, and sensing that defeat and further bloodshed were close at hand, General Lee signed an armistice with Lieutenant General Grant the day after, giving a farewell address in which he said, "With an unceasing admiration of your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous consideration for myself, I bid you an affectionate farewell." Now we're going to take a look at why the North won the war. And many people have put forward this idea, this lost cause argument, which is that the South could never have won the war. I partially subscribe to this. I think it would be incredibly difficult for the South to have won. But then again, all the South needed to do to win the war was to stop the North from invading her. The South's aim wasn't to invade and capture the North. The only reason they invaded the North was to dissuade the citizens of the North that it was worth bringing the South back in. If they could bring the war to the citizens of the North and make them so angsty about this war that they would say to their politicians, look, we're not going ahead with this, just call off the war, the South can have their independence, the South would have won. And although that's true, I don't think the North would have stopped, and the North had the resources to keep going, whereas the South did not. Now, here are a few of my reasons why I think the North won, and I think many people would agree with me. Obviously, manpower is a massive one. The Union at its height had over 2 million men in uniform, to the Confederacy's almost 1 million. In fact, I think the Confederacy had at most about 900,000 men in uniform rather than 1 million. And as I said, at all the major engagements, the Confederates were outnumbered by the... As well as this, the Union factories could produce cloth, munitions, food and other essentials faster, better and longer than the Confederacy's. In fact, at the end of the war, the Confederates, what they did was they couldn't produce any more uniforms, which is often why in the movies and pictures of the time and paintings, you see that there are a few Confederate guys in the nice grey uniforms with nice grey cappies on, but a lot of them have just got average shirts on, randomly coloured trousers and hats on, and that's because as the embargo, which was part of the Anaconda Plan, no one could trade with the South, apart from maybe Mexico because they had a land border. But no one could trade with them, and that was a blockade. And so they couldn't get the dyes in, they couldn't produce enough of it themselves, so they had to do their own thing. And one of the things that the Confederates actually did was when they shot a Northerner, they would take off the uniform of the Northerner. Obviously, they wouldn't wear it because then, their own side would think they were a Northerner and shoot them. But what they then did was that they got the uniform and they boiled it and they dyed it with natural things they could get their hands on, and then you had a northern uniform, but say in a sort of yellowy brown colour, which they called butternut. So you had a lot of Confederates who actually wore northern uniforms from guys they'd shot, but then which had been dyed to this other colour. Which is, it goes to show the resourcefulness of the South. Even as, they were embargoed and invaded by the North, they still came up with creative ways to keep going and keep fighting. But apart from that fun little detour about uniforms, there were also more important things at stake, like the Union produced far more field artillery pieces in 1 year than the Confederacy did in the entire war. So the advantage of industrialization and advantage of having these factories really, really helped the Union, whereas the Confederacy couldn't say the same. They didn't have, the same advantages. The Confederacy actually hoped that there would be foreign intervention from either Britain or France, and actually sent lots of envoys to Europe to try and get them involved. Now, obviously, Britain would still perhaps have a bone to pick with the Americans for the War of 1812, which ended inconclusively, because Britain and America weren't really massive fans of each other for quite a while after the American Revolution. you could argue they still aren't. And by the way, yes, there should be a U in honour. America, I'm sorry to say, but you're wrong. But as we know, this didn't happen. If it had happened, who knows? The British could have invaded from Canada. I don't know what the French would have done, but they could have sent, aid to the Confederates. They could have trained them like they did with the American Continental Army in the American Revolution. But this didn't happen. As well as this, the Confederacy, the fighting was on Confederate soil most of the time. Now, Lee did push into the north with not much success, because every time he was stopped at Antietam and Gettysburg, which were defeats, which meant the Confederacy had to retreat. And for the rest of the war, it was mostly fought in Virginia. Because of this, the war's on home soil. And the whole Confederate idea that they should push north to so infuriate the northern populace that they would say to the politicians, look, it's not worth it, let's call this war off, we don't want it anymore. It was instead on southern soil, so it wasn't as bad for the northerners. If you think about the First World War, the whole aim for the Germans invading Belgium and France was, well, if we invade them, it's on French and Belgian soil rather than German soil. But for the British, it wasn't as bad because they hadn't been invaded. So the British public were more for the war. As well as this, the Confederacy failed to hand the Union a crippling blow. Sure, they won some great victories. They won, for example, at the First and Second Battle of Bull Run. They won at Fredericksburg. They absolutely hammered them at Fredericksburg. But there wasn't anything that really the Union couldn't recover from. And the Union did recover very well from these defeats. Partially because of industrialization, because they could keep producing munitions, keep producing ammunition, keep getting men to the front, and because they had a larger manpower from which to draw men. As well as this, I think the biggest reason why the North won was because of the Anaconda Plan, which was, as I said, troops going down the centre, attacking on land, blockade of the South, which you can see there on the map, the Union blockade of the forts, which sort of goes around Florida and upwards, and then also the attack of gunboats down the rivers to take the coastal cities. It really did work, and in the end, that's what brought the South to her knees. Now, just as important as the reasons as to why and the key events are the consequences of the American Civil War, which we can still see today. Slavery became illegal. Black people became freed. Now, this sounds great, and obviously it is great, because obviously I'm not for slavery, and I think no one should be a slave. But it wasn't happy and dandy times for black people. I think it was W. Du Bois who said that after slavery, black people had a brief spell in the sun before a large cloud covered them in darkness, or something along those lines. I'm terrible at remembering the wording of quotes, but I find it really poignant. Because after the era of reparation, white Southerners found another way of oppressing black people, notably with the Jim Crow laws. You have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan to stop black people from voting, these kind of things. And up until the 1960s, these systems remained in place. And some would argue even today, although I'm not going to get into that. These institutions to stop black people from having the same rights as white people. But what we need to know, at the end of the Civil War, slavery became illegal throughout every state, and black people were freed. This also had implications for the workforce, because you now have all these black people who were slaves. They had been given food, they had been given shelter, they had a purpose, they had a role in life. Now they were free. This had a double whammy. They were free, but they weren't given really anything. They weren't given money, they weren't given a place to live, they weren't given a place to sleep, they weren't given a job. And the Southern economy collapsed because it was based on slavery, so black people were often put in much worse situations than they had been as slaves, especially the better off house slaves. But that's enough for another video, really. And as I said, the Southern economy collapsed. Obviously, all these men went to war and were killed, and some came back maimed. And the economy had been based upon slavery. The blockade had strangled the Confederate nations, and the Southern economy can't put up with it, and it collapsed. 620,000 deaths, 360,000 of which had been from the North and 260,000 from the Confederacy. Obviously, lots of people died. There was a lot of grief in this time from sons, fathers, brothers who didn't come home. And as well as this, hundreds of thousands of injured veterans returned home, some with terrible, mental and physical disabilities. Well, it seems obvious, but the Union, it was reunified, which is why we have just one United States of America rather than a Confederate States and a United States or whatever. And this new Union also had different things. As I said, after the American Civil War, the Union stopped secession being a legal practice for states, and it also changed the relationship between the states and what rights a state could decide and what right the federal government had to decide. This is a very immediate consequence that President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in a theatre by Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. There were also stricter laws on states in secession, was made illegal, as I said. And as well as this, there was more expansion westwards. You have the cattle trade, the rise of the cowboy, and the Indian Wars. Because obviously you have all these veterans coming home. You've got this war that's just ended. Lots and lots of people perhaps wanting to get away. Especially in the South, you have a lot of people. The economy has collapsed, and they head out. Now, one of the interesting things is the cattle trade, which, that is the rise of the cowboy. And because of all these cowboys going west, Native Americans don't like it because it's their land. They attack the cowboys. The army gets sent in, and you've got the Indian Wars, which happened. Now, partially because of the cattle trade, is that before the war you had, lots and lots of cattle pens, especially in Texas, especially in the South. And while they're away, these cattle are just left. And what do cattle do when they don't have anything to do? Well, they hump each other. So basically, you have a veteran, goes away for 4 years, and he had, say, 5,000 cattle. And these are selective breeding cattle. So, he's just got the best of the best cattle who have got the best meat or the best milk or whatever. But he goes away for 4 years, and then suddenly you've got his prize cow humping, this being humped by this bull who doesn't have all these genes that they want. So then he comes back and he's got suddenly 30,000 cattle. I don't know all the maths of that. I don't know if that's even possible, but there you go. So he's got far more cattle. And because of this, the price of meat, because there's so much cattle, plummets. And basically, the cattle trade collapses. Until you have this grand idea by one man who was called Goodnight and Loving? No, there were two men called Goodnight and Loving who decided to take their cattle north, and then you get the whole moving the cattle onto the Great Plains. You get the obviously the cowboys who looked after them, and then you get the conflict with the Native Americans. So that's how the American Civil War created the cowboy, which is a whole nother video again, which I can go into. Now, this has been a very, very long video, and I apologise because at the start I promised it would be brief, but I really, really do hope that you have enjoyed this. I hope I've been able to sum up the American Civil War for those of you who don't know, but I don't really think it's possible to sum it up, with less time, because I think it deserves a lot more time, and I'm definitely going to be making more videos about it. Please tell me if you enjoyed this video, if you'd like to see more videos on the American Civil War. I've got a few more planned, but not loads, so if it's something you're not really interested in, obviously I won't make more on it, but if you do like it, please do let me know. Now, obviously I've got more videos coming on the American Civil War, one about the flags used in the American Civil War, and a few others. Please do follow me on Twitter at HistoryWHilbert, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Thanks very much for watching, and I shall see you next time.